G'day guys, this is Andrew Price here from blenderguru.com, coming at you today with a very exciting tutorial, something I've been wanting to do for a very long time, and that is to use the new dynamic paint tool in Blender to create realistic rain. So what you're looking at right now is the finished result, just an example demonstration of what we're going to be doing in this tutorial. So for those of you who don't know, dynamic paint, it's a new feature in Blender, and it allows objects to interact with other objects. So essentially, if you have one object that is in contact with another object, you can make it paint it. So this can be used for footsteps, somebody walking through snow or something like that, flames burning the wall, all those really, really cool stuff that was really, really hard to do previously in Blender is now quite easy. So it's a really, really cool feature, and it's very new as well. So I'm sure a lot of you are very curious how to use it. So I've spent the past week and a bit getting my head around it myself, figuring out how to make it all work. So I'm now just going to be sharing with you exactly how to do it in this tutorial. So as always, before we get into it, let's take a look at the finished scene in Blender. So this is what it looks like. Now, I'm not going to be showing you how to create the entire scene from scratch, so I'm not going to be doing the mountains or anything like that. We're just going to be focusing on the rain and the dynamic paint. So I'm going to be showing you how to set up a particle system and then basically have it interact with the road. So essentially, the way dynamic paint works, it's very, very simple. You have a brush and you have a canvas. Now, in this case, the rain, these particles here, that is going to be the brush, and then the road here, if I can click it. No, Blender is very, very slow. The road is the canvas, basically. So when the particles touch the road, then you are able to paint onto it. So this is an example of what the dynamic paint does. So this little curve shape here is actually the road, which has been UV unwrapped. So that's it from the top. There you go. So it's been UV unwrapped, and those little droplets, as they hit them, they create a little black dot. And these are actually frames. So if I scroll through here, you can see that those dots are getting thicker and thicker. That's because more and more particles are hitting it, and they are painting it. So it starts out white, and then it gets blacker and blacker till eventually it's completely black, and then, that's the road is completely submerged in water. Anyway, that's the basic fundamentals of dynamic paint. So I'm going to be showing you how to set all that up. So that's all done here in these physics panel here. It's all very new and exciting. Now, as I said before, I'm not going to show you how to do the entire scene. So I've made the starting file available for you to download. So this is it right here. It's exactly what you saw before. There's no plants though, because they're part of the Nature Academy, so I've removed them. But everything else is exactly the same. So go ahead and download that, and we can get cracking. Now, before we start, I thought it might be worth taking a look at how real rain looks. So it was a few months ago. I was at my parents' house, and it started bucketing down with rain, and I thought, I'm probably going to need this for the future. At some point I can use it for reference video or put it in the Nature Academy or whatever. Anyway, it turns out I can use it because I'm doing a rain tutorial now. This is just basically to show you how rain looks when it hits the ground. So you can see the little ripples down in the bottom right hand corner as the rain hits it. There's these tiny little ripples that ripple outwards. Now, if you were to try and do that using the fluid simulator, you would have your head in trying to to render thousands and thousands of little obstacles hitting a fluid simulator. It'd be really, really cumbersome, and it probably wouldn't even work. But using dynamic paint, it's got a feature that does waves specifically, so that's very, very cool. And you'll notice that there are also those little splashes as the droplet hits it. There's a splash. Now, if we wanted to get really realistic particles, what you'd want it to do is when the particle hits the ground, you would want more particles to appear to create that little splash effect. Now, to do that, you would need reactor particles, which is something that Blender used to have, but then now it doesn't anymore because they're revamping it and they're doing node particles and whatever else. So we can't actually do that. However, it's very, very subtle, and you couldn't really notice it in my example anyway. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to fake it by using our wet maps. So essentially, we're going to make it so that when a droplet hits the ground, it's going to leave a little white dot, and it's going to appear for just maybe 3 or 4 frames, and then it's going to disappear. And that's going to fake that little splashing effect that you can see right here. So with the reference video done, let's go ahead and get stuck into the tutorial. So open up the starting scene in Blender, which should look just like this. And the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and add in the rain. So we're going to be using a particle system. So I'm going to go ahead and add a plane, and I'm just going to scale it up to be the size of my scene, which is about there. It doesn't have to cover the mountains, just something small like that is fine. And then I'm just going to position it above the scene, making sure that it is out of view of the camera, because if it's in the view of the camera, then you're going to be able to see where the particles are born, which you don't want. Then go ahead and add a particle system to it. And for my my finished animation, I think I used 300,000 particles, and I set it up over 350 frames. So it was a little bit, wasn't as heavy as I probably would have liked. So I'm going to go ahead and set it for, again, 300,000 particles now, but I'm going to set it for 100 frames. So it should look about 3 times as dense as my example. So it should be sort of bucketing down with rain, which is something more what I was going for. So yeah, setting that to 100 frames there, 300,000 particles. And then underneath velocity, you want to set the normal amount to be -5, and that is going to force the particles downwards. So it looks like they have already got some speed, like they've been falling from the sky, as opposed to have just been born. So that's better. And you also want to set the random amount to be about a 0.5 as well, just so they've got a little bit more direction to them, like they're not all falling down in a straight line. The other one is underneath the render settings. So you want to first of all uncheck emitter so that the actual plane itself doesn't show up in any renders. And I'm going to use something that I've never really used in a tutorial before, but it was one that I saw in another tutorial on YouTube. Somebody else used it and it worked quite well. And that is to use line particles. Okay, so what this does is essentially it renders all of those particles as lines. Go figure. It's pretty simple. So it uses a sort of a halo particle system, halo material, at least that's my understanding of it, to render these little lines. And it works quite well. It's not a bad little effect, so I'm going to go ahead and use that. Now the back amounts, that's really the only one you want to pay attention to. Just go ahead and change that to be however big you want those lines to be. So 0.5 is too big. I'm going to set it to 0.1, and that creates some more realistic, smaller sized looking droplets. So rendered done, display. You might want to turn the display down. Oh, actually no, sorry. You can't do that. Yeah, that's one little note. If you turn down the display, then that's going to affect the dynamic paint. So make sure you don't touch the display. There you go. Okay, all these other ones are good. Okay, cool. So the next thing you want to do is you want to select the road here, and you want to turn on collision. Now, ideally what you'd want it to do is so that when the droplets hit the road, they die. So you would go to the road, you'd select the road, you click on collision, and then you select kill particles. And I tried that, and what I found was that sometimes the particles weren't actually registering in dynamic paint before they were killed. So what you'd find is that about half of the particles that hit the ground actually showed up in dynamic paint. And it was a problem. So what I decided to do instead was to turn off kill particles. Basically when they hit the road here, they won't disappear. You want to turn particle dampening up to 1, particle friction up to 1, and then so that means the particles are going to hit the road, and then they're just going to stay exactly where they fell. And then the problem there is that you've then got particles that are sitting on the road and they're visible to the camera, which doesn't look realistic. So what you want to do is you want to make the particle lifetime essentially so that when it hits the road, they die anyway. So if that makes sense. So sort of 1 frame after they die. So to determine the lifetime, the correct lifetime of the particles, what you want to do is just cycle through the animation. So you can see right there, that's when the particles are going to be hitting the road. Let's just check. Yep, about there. So that is frame 32. So 33. I'm going to set the lifetime for the particles here. I'm going to set them to 33, like that. So now if you play that back, what you should see is the particles all disappearing, and some of them should be hitting the road. Now, you'll notice here that the particles aren't hitting the road. They're sort of going through it. And the reason for that is that the particles have to be on the same layer as the object which it's colliding with. So in this case, it's not. So I'm going to go ahead and move my particles to layer 1 so that they are together like this. And now if I play it back, I should see them hitting the road like that. There you go. You can see it's working because you've got these little straight lines there, which mean a particle's hit it and it's now lying down. So there you go. Perfect. All right. So got the particles set up now. Now what you need to do is to bake the particles. So one thing to do is to turn the cache step down to 1. And that is again to basically help it with dynamic paint, because if you leave it as 10, it's going to set keyframes every 10 frames, and that can cause problems with dynamic paint. So set it to 1, and you might also want to turn the step size. Where was step size? I think it's in physics. Oh, subframes, sorry. Yeah, set that to about 2, and that's just going to smooth out the physics a little bit. That's sort of my understanding. Generally, things work a little bit better when you use some subframes, so just throw them in there. It'll increase the baking time slightly, but it always gives it kind of a smoother looking result. So set that as 1, then go ahead and click Bake All Dynamics. Okay, so that's going to whir away. Once it gets to 100, it means it is complete. And there we go. Okay, cool. So now that they have baked, now what we can do is go ahead and get into the dynamic paint. Okay, so first thing you need to do with the dynamic paint is, as I mentioned before, there is a canvas and then there is a brush. So in this case, the particles are going to be our brush. So go ahead with the particles selected. We're going to go to the physics panel and we're going to go to dynamic paint. Now you're only going to see this, by the way, if you're using a version of Blender 2.61 and up. So make sure you've got that. Otherwise you won't see it. Go ahead and click that. And you can see you've got 2 options here for dynamic paint, canvas and brush. So go ahead, click brush, and then click Add Brush. Okay, so this is going to ask you what color you want it to paint. Okay, so by default it's set to blue, which I don't really understand. I don't know anybody that would want blue. We're going to go ahead and set that to black. Okay, because what we're going to do is this road here is going to be a solid white canvas, and then these droplets are going to be forming those black dots onto the road, and that is then going to be used in the texture panel to add all those extra effects and stuff. So setting that to black, and you also want to turn off absolute alpha, otherwise it's going to cause some problems where if one particle overlaps over another, it's going to kind of make it look darker than it should be. It just, it doesn't look very good. And for the dynamic paint source, you want to change it to particle system, and then from the drop down, just select the name of the particle system there. And this is a big one right here. This is the solid radius amount. Okay, so this is one that I had to experiment a lot with to kind of figure out what was the right radius to work with. I think I went with a 0.15 or something, which you can see in the rendered animation. The droplets do look too big. When they hit the road, it looks like a water balloon hit it or something. So this is basically how big the mark is when it touches it. Okay, so I'm gonna set it to 0.1 this time, and hopefully that's gonna give a sort of a nice looking result. You've also got smooth radius as well, so you can make it have a kind of a smoothing radius around it. So that's something you might want to play with. Leave dynamic paint velocity. To be honest, I haven't figured out what that one does yet, so I'm just going to leave that. And then dynamic paint waves, we can go ahead and leave that as well, and that is all fine. Okay, cool. So now getting on to the road itself. So before we go ahead and add the road, as a dynamic paint object, we need to UV unwrap it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and select the road right here, bring up the UV image editor like this. Hit X, and if you're starting your own scene, you won't have it UV unwrapped already, but in my case I have, because I've actually got the road texture using a separate UV map, so I'm going to have to add another UV map. So I'm going here to the object data panel here, and I'm going to add a new UV map, and I'm going to call this one dynamic paint, like that. And now I'm going to hit U and then select project from view, and then what you want to do is just scale this up so it's as big as you can make it in this little box here, basically, because however big well, basically when you do the dynamic paint, you have to set the size of the canvas, like how high resolution you want the images to bake to. So if you can kind of get this as big as possible, then you're going to get some more higher resolution looking rain. So that pretty much does it right there. So once we've done that, we can close that. Now going to the going to the physics panel, we can now go ahead and click on dynamic paint, and this is our canvas, of course. So go ahead and click on add canvas. So here you've got most of the settings for dynamic paint. Okay, so you have got, first of all, you've got one thing that says vertex or image sequence. Okay, now what that applies to is, do you want the effects so that when it hits it, it actually applies to these individual vertices, so you can make sort of ripples or dints and stuff in the actual shape of it, or you can have it so that it bakes it to individual image sequence files, which is the one that I showed you before. So that's the one we're going to go ahead and use. So go ahead and click on that. And then once you do that, you'll notice that the settings change, okay? So just make a note of that. Settings do change. So we're setting it to image sequence. And then for the resolution, 256 is too small for our scene. So you want to choose something that's appropriate. Keep in mind, the larger you make that, then the longer your baking times are going to be. Now, it's a good idea to keep it in multiples of 4, I was told. So, you could set it to 256, 512 if you wanted to, or I'm going to set mine to 1024, okay? The reason you keep it in rules of 4 is that Blender just works faster in that method. I don't understand why that is, but it's just the way it is. So keep things like that. Whenever you're adding like a UV image map or anything like that, keep it in rule of 4s, and it's going to work better. The other thing is you want to make sure that the start and end frames are appropriate for the scene. Now you might think 1 and 100 is good because we've got 100 frames in our scene. However, we don't actually need the first 32 frames, I think it is. Let's go back, 30. Okay, yeah, we can make it start at frame 30. Yeah, we can make it start at frame 30. So go ahead and do that right now, because otherwise it's just going to bake for those first 30 frames and it's just going to be a waste. So it's just going to be, added baking time. You're not going to be using it. So just set it to 30 and that's just going to save us a bit of time. And you're also going to turn the sub steps up. Again, this is just going to smooth it out a little bit better. Set that up to 5. And then down here, you've got the paint options. So for the surface type, you have got paint, displace, and waves. Now for this tutorial, we're going to use paint, and we're also going to use waves later on. So paint is essentially going to be adding those, black dots. It's like imagining if it was raining oil from the sky onto a white canvas. Not a very attractive thought, but if it was, that's essentially what this is going to be doing. It's going to be painting it. And you've got the wet map drying. Don't worry about that yet. We're going to be using that later when we get into adding the little white dots later on. Then down here underneath the dynamic paint output, this is where you need to select the UV map. Now, if you're just using your own scene, you're only going to have one there. We created another UV map before, so I'm selecting that one there. And then you also want to save the folder, set the folder where you want those image files to be baked. That's very important. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to locate them later on. So make sure you save it somewhere where you can find it. If you're like me, your computer hard drive is just a jumble assortments of things with numbers for names and everything. And anyway, try and keep things organized. That's my point. Okay, so I'm going to go Dynamic Maps 2, because you can see I've been practicing. Okay, good. And now this is an important one, PNG or OpenEXR. Now they both have their uses. In this case, we can get away with PNG, but when we use the waves later on, we're going to have to use OpenEXR, but I'll get to that when I get to that. So anyway, just set it as PNG for the paint option right now. And paint maps, make sure that's checked. We don't need wet maps yet, so just leave that off. Pre-multiply alpha doesn't really matter that much. Now for the dynamic paint initial color, no, we're going to turn that off as well. Now the dynamic paint effects, that's one we're going to turn on. We're going to check use spread. And what that's going to do is it is going to, when the droplet hits the ground, it's going to spread slightly. Now the spread speed, that's the speed of the spread. It doesn't apply to how much it actually spreads. And as far as I can tell, I don't think that there is a way to increase how much it spreads with other things, which I think would be a very valuable thing if it was included. You could have like amount of spread as an option there, and then you could have it so that it increases spread, whatever. Anyway, it doesn't. So that's just the speed of it. So just set them as 1 and 1, and that's going to be fine. Collision, that's not part of it. That's just the extra thing we added up here. Anyway, with everything else in place, provided you've done everything correctly, we can then go ahead, make sure you save it. Go ahead now and click on Bake Image Sequence. And what this is going to do is it's going to bake those individual frames one by one, and it's going to be saving it to the hard drive. So once that gets to 100, again, that means it's finished. Okay, so it's finished the baking now, and if you've done it correctly, what you should see on your hard drive is something that looks a little bit like this, a whole bunch of images, and if you open them up, they, it just looks like a bunch of speckledy stuff. You can see that as it gets to, once it gets to frame 100 here, the last frame, you can see that it's almost solid black, and that means the black areas, by the way, the parts where the rain has hit, so that's the part when we set it up in the texture file, texture settings, that it's actually going to be mirrored. So that's the part that's going to look wet. So once it's meaning that it's solid black, that would mean that the entire thing is completely mirrored reflection looking like water. So in this case, we've got a few little patches where the rain hasn't hit, but that's fine. It's just going to add a little bit more realism to it, I suppose, having little tiny puddles in it. So that's quite fine. So now to use these files, what we're going to do is jump back to Blender. And we're going to go and into our material settings here. Now, I've already got a material for the road here. Got a whole bunch of textures and stuff here, masks and whatever else. Don't worry about the stuff that's already there. We're just going to be using these 3 texture slots. So the first texture slot that I'm going to use, I'm going to call this one Paint. And we're going to go ahead and set it to from a cloud to image, like this one. The other 2 we're going to be adding later. That's for the waves and then the wet maps later on. So for the image, we want to go ahead and add a image. So go ahead, click open, and then just select where you saved it before, and just select one of these files like that. Go ahead and hit open, and then go where it says source and change it from single image to image sequence. And what that's going to allow you to do is to, it's now going to use all of those images in that sequence, and it knows what's in the sequence according to what number is associated with it. So that's going to be fine. But one thing you want to do though is, because we've got it starting at frame 30, you want to make sure that you set these start and offset at the correct one, or else it's not going to be able to, otherwise it's going to start at frame 1 with frame 30 of the baked file, if that makes sense. So for the start, we're going to set that to 30, and then for the offset, I'm going to set that to 29. And to check that it's okay, you can see here where it says image, size, RGB byte, and then it's got the name there. That's the one that it's loaded in currently. So that's paint map 0053. That means it's frame 53 of the paint map. And that's the correct frame that we're on right now, which is 53. So that means it's set up correctly. So all you need to do is essentially just set that start to whatever, starting frame for this one is. And then the offset, just set that to 1 less. So in this case, it is 29. Okay, so now going down into the mapping options, you want to make sure that you change it to UV, and then select the UV map there, the one that we created. And then down here, you want to set the color influence, okay? So essentially, we want it to make it look as though when the rain hits it, it makes the ground look a little bit darker, because that's what water does, really. When it hits, concrete, you can imagine it looks a little bit darker. You don't want it to be solid black, so you might want to set this to around about a 0.6 or 0.7, just so that it slightly darkens the road, so something like that. And the big one is the ray mirror amount. So we're going to go ahead and check that. And then we're going to set that to be 0.2, because again, we don't want it to be like a completely mirrored reflection. You want to make it look like water. So 0.2, that means part of the original texture, the road texture itself is going to be showing through, but it's partly reflective as well. That's something I found worked quite nicely. So we're going to go ahead and leave it as that. But once you've done that, you've selected ray mirror, you also need to go back to the material settings and then make sure that you check mirror. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to use that properly. So let's just have a look at the preview image that we've got here. If I just turn off the ray mirror and turn off the color, you can see that's the original one right there. Let's just click that. So that's with the color, and then with the ray mirror, it's adding that little slight reflection to it. So yeah, so it's coming along quite nicely. So now we've got the paint done. Now what we're going to do is go ahead and get into the waves, okay? So for this, with the road still selected, we're going to go back to the physics panel here. And we're not going to add another dynamic paint because it's already checked. What we need to do is here where it's got the surface, we can go ahead and add another canvas. So go ahead and click that plus button there. And I'm going to go ahead and call this one waves. And then for the format, we're going to set that to image sequence. There is, by the way, two ways of making waves appear using the dynamic paint. You can use vertex, which will make it, actually, I think you can actually see it here. Oh, maybe not. But anyway, basically, you can make it so that it actually creates ripple effects just from the vertex, which is quite a cool effect. So that actually you can see the ripples in the 3D viewport. However, because we've got so much rain, all these raindrops falling at the same time, if you were to have, if you wanted it to look realistic, you would have to have possibly millions of vertices so that it could do that. So that's out of the question. So it's unnecessary. So instead, we're just going to go ahead and use the image sequence, and then we can take the images that it bakes from this, the little wave files, the little wave paintings, we can then use that in the textures here. So that's what we're going to do. So setting that to image sequence, and again, you want to set the resolution to something appropriate. I'm going to set mine to 1024 again, and setting the start to 30 because of course the first 30 frames aren't used. I'm going to set the sub steps to be 5, and then for the surface type, we want to change that to be waves. And when you do that, you'll notice that the settings do change as well. So this is it before, and now this is it once we've changed it. So essentially all you've got here are these two ones here. These are the ones you want to pay attention to. The spring amount, that applies to sort of how quickly the surface returns to, I wasn't even looking at the screen. Anyway, how quickly it pulls the water back to zero. So essentially when it creates a ripple, you want it to just quickly ripple and then just disappear. You don't want the ripple to carry on and sort of, cause other rippling, throughout the whole thing. It just looks a little bit unnecessary. So I'm going to set this to 0. And by the way, I think if you're using the official Blender build, the lowest you can set it to is 0.01. I didn't find much of a difference with it, so it's not that too big of a problem. Anyway, set that to 0. And then for the dampening, this applies to how big the ripple effect is before it disappears. So the higher you set that to, then the smaller the ripple is going to be. So I'm going to set this to 0.6. I found that was a value that worked quite well. So 0.6 and 0 should work fine. Then down here, of course, making sure you select the right UV map again. And then we're just going to save it in another folder here. I'm going to call this one waves. Click accept. And this is the other big one. For the file format, we need to use OpenEXR. And the reason for that is that if you use PNG, when you add it as a bump map later on, what you get are these little artifacts that appear in the bump map. And it looks kind of like this distorted, speckledy mess where the ripples appear. And for a while, I was really confused why it wasn't turning out smooth and clear like some of the ones that I'd seen on YouTube. And I couldn't figure it out. And that's just because PNG doesn't have enough color information to create a clear ripple effect. So if you set that to OpenEXR, then you're going to get some smoother, clearer looking ripples. So go ahead and do that. Everything else is set up. So then all we need to do is go ahead and click on Bake Image Sequence again. Alright, so once you finish baking the waves, it could take, about 5 or 10 minutes. I think it took me about 7 or 8 just then. But anyway, once you finished it, you should see, if you locate the folder where you saved it, a whole bunch of exe files like this. Unless you've got a program that can open it, it's probably hard to see what it is. I'm just going to show you right now. I've got Photoshop installed, so I'm going to go ahead and open this. And I'll just show you what it looks like because it confused me a little bit when I saw it. So I'll just show you what I mean. So once it opens, you should see basically a big gray map like this. And if you zoom in, you can't really see anything different. So you're probably thinking, well, it didn't bake properly then. And for a while, I couldn't figure out how on earth to get it to work. And I was trying to think, man, how do I get this to work so you can actually see the ripple effects or anything. But I actually found out that they are actually there. They're just very, 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 very slight. So if I go ahead and just add a level right here, if I just turn this down like so, then you can see
that there are ripple effects there. You just have to turn the contrast way down till you can actually see them, but you can see that it's actually got those little ripple effects there. And again, I'm obviously not going to save that because you need it to be the way it is. So I'm just going to go ahead and close that. So yeah, each of these are baked. So if you had a look at each of these EXR files, you'd see the ripples, you know, appearing and then expanding and rippling out, and yeah, basically animated. So that's yeah, that's perfectly fine. As long as you've got that, you can go ahead and use it. So the way we're going to use it is going back to the texture panel right here. I'm going to go ahead and call this texture here waves. You can call it ripples if you want. Set it to image, and just like we did before, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select the first image right there, wave 0030, and then I'm going to set it to image sequence, and then set the start to 30, and then the offset to 29, and of course you can tell which that you've done it correctly. If I just... That's a way to refresh it, by the way. Like if you change frame, like to say frame 50 right there, you can see that the image name here hasn't updated. So if you just change these settings, then you can see that it updates it there. So you can see we're on frame 50 and it's now using wave 0050, which means that it's done correctly. And then just go down here, turn off color, and then we're going to turn on normal. And for the ripples to actually look correct, you need to actually set them as minus values. So I found for mine a value of about -2. It worked out quite well. And then you also want to set the bump mapping to be best quality. I just found that gave the best quality. And then for the mapping, of course, like we did before, set it to UV and then set that map to dynamic paint, and everything else should be correct. So let's go ahead now. Let's just give this a quick render. I'm going to save it first, give it a quick render, and see what we've got so far. And make sure you've got the right layers selected. You can see I haven't got my lamp turned on. So let's go ahead. Let's try re-rendering that again. Okay, so we've got the result here. You can see that the rain, I forgot to set the materials. Something I should have done when after I set the particle settings. Anyway, we can do it now. Basically, we're just going to go ahead and I'm going to turn the intensity of the specularity for the rain down to about 0.2, and then I'm going to set the hardness up to 500, and we want just that's just going to make a really light shimmer effect closer to this lamp here. That's going to look quite nice. And we want there to be some transparency, because as you can see, the rain is like solid white at the moment and it looks very fake. So I'm going to set the alpha to be 0.02, and I'm going to set the specularity to be the same. And I found sometimes turning on ray trace can help, just if it have problems like reflections otherwise, like you don't see the rain in the reflections or whatever. So turning that on can help. Anyway, let's go ahead, give that another render now and see how it looks. Okay, much better. So you can see the rain's looking good, and you can see that the surface of the water, you can see it's getting reflections, which is working nicely. And I'm not sure if you can see it there, but I think there are ripple effects. Assuming there are, because it should be working. But anyway, we want them to be subtle, so they're not really that not easily viewed from this far away from the camera, but once the camera gets closer to it, you can see it a little bit better. One other thing that I'm going to do is going back to the texture that we didn't add, but it's already here in the starting scene. That's the road texture. I've just got a road texture off CG Textures here. What I want to do is give it a bump map, and that's going to really add a nice effect to it, because if you don't, the whole road just looks very flat, very clean, like a perfect mirror basically, and it just looks very fake. So giving it some very slight bump map will add lots of realism to your scene. So I'm going to set this to 0.06. So that's a really low amount, but it's yeah, it's just going to add some really nice yeah, some nice bump map to it, and it's going to show through in those puddles, and it's going to look a lot nicer. So give it another render now and see how it looks. And there we go. So you can't really see it that easily, but you can see some very slight bump map coming through in that reflection just there. And when the camera gets close to it, you can see it a lot more clearly, but it will add a lot more realism to the scene. And one other point on that just there, if you have the bump map turned on, you can't really get that effect where it looks like the whole road has been submerged, like it's just, you know, solid water. You won't get that effect because this bump map will make it look very shallow, because obviously you're having bump map from the road showing through the water, so it's going to look like the water is you know, quite shallow. So one thing you can do, and this is a really cool trick, is if you have it, you know, later on in the animation, if you want it so that after the rain's been pouring for ages, you want to make it look like it's covered in water, what you can do is animate this value right there. And you do that by, let's say you wanted the last 20 frames to appear as if it's been saturated. You'd create a keyframe right there on frame 80, and then you just jump to the last frame where you want it to be submerged, and then you just set that to 0, and then you hit I again. Oh, that's, sorry, I pressed I before, I didn't tell you. So you just hover over it and press I, and you can see that that value there will now animate, so that once it gets to the final frame, there won't be any bump map and the road will look more submerged in the water, basically. So that's just a quick little tip there that I thought I would share with you. But you can see it's coming across quite nicely. Now there is one final thing that we're going to do, and that is to add those little tiny white specks to it, so that when the raindrop hits it, it adds that little dot, and it just gives it just something else which looks more realistic than if you just have nothing. So it'll create that kind of little splash effect that just looks really nice. So the way we're going to do that is going back to the dynamic paint here and clicking on the surface. We're going to use this same one right here. And we're going to be using wet maps. So down here underneath the output, we're going to uncheck paint maps and we're going to check wet maps. Now, the reason that we didn't do them both at the same time, that would be cool if we could, is because these wet maps, I should explain what a wet map is basically. And a wet map will allow you to animate something which should be drying. So for example, if you had a brick wall and you were to throw some fluid onto it, for example, you could then have it so that it appears very wet, but then over time it slowly dries up. So that's what having a wet map will do, and that's why you use it instead of a paint map. So in this particular instance, we're going to use it by having a little white speck appear and then disappear after about 4 frames or so. So what we're going to do is check wet map, make sure you've unchecked paint map, and then going up here where it says wet map drying, I'm going to set this to 8. Okay, so that's 8 frames, but it probably won't appear to be 8. It'll be around about 3 or 4. That's what you'll see. So that's perfect for what we want. So setting that like that is fine. And for the initial color, we're going to set this to be black. Now this initial color, that's the initial color of the canvas. So when we see the actual texture showing up there, what it's going to, if we have a look at the finished bake texture, it's going to be solid black except for some little white specks on it. Okay, sorry, I'm not thinking very well today. Now the dynamic paint effects, you want to make sure you uncheck use spread, because you don't want those little white droplets to spread. You just want them to be appearing and then disappearing. So initial color set to black is fine. And then going back to the particles here, and this is why we have to do it separately again, it's because we want to make sure that the solid radius is a lot smaller. Otherwise, you're going to get massive white dots showing up at the exact same size as those puddle effects, which is going to look really bad and really stupid. So you want to make sure that you set the solid radius down to a 0.010. So that's the lowest amount you can, and also turn the smooth radius off as well. And that's going to give you a really small, very tight looking little speck, and that's going to look great. So that's why we're going to use that. And for the brush, for the wet map, you want to make sure that you set this the paint to be white, just like that. Okay, so everything else is fine. Send that up to 30. Yes, everything else is good to go. Of course, make sure that you set the appropriate folder. I think it already is set. That's cool. Okay, so now just go ahead and click on Bake Image Sequence for the final time, and then we'll check it out once it's finished. Okay, so once it's finished baking, go ahead and check out the folder where you saved it, and you should see a whole bunch of black textures like this. And if you have a look at them closely, you'll see tiny little white specks like that, which is exactly what we want. And if you cycle through it, it should look like little twinkling stars, which basically means that everything is working perfectly. So then just jump back to Blender, go to the material settings, textures, going to add a new texture, and this one is going to be splashes, and we're going to set it to image. Then we're just going to open up the same folder where it is before. Just click on wet map, the first image right there. Click open. Then select image sequence. And then again, like we did before, we're going to set the start to be 30 and then offset to be 29 so that it's using the correct one. I'll just check. Okay, 74, frame 74. Yep, that's fine. It all matches up. And then for the mapping, again, set it to UV, dynamic paint. And then this is the important part. We want it to basically just apply to the color of the texture itself. So right here, but we want to make sure that the blend type is screen. Otherwise, it's going to make the entire plane look black, and that's something that I was kind of puzzled with, why sometimes it would turn up black, and it was just annoying me. And then I figured out it's the blend setting has to be set to screen so that only the white values show through and the black value is ignored. So that's the way to do it. So now let's just give this a quick render right now. I'm just going to set that into the buffer so we can just compare it to the one before it. And I set the color, I'll set that to be a 0.8, just because you don't want it to be solid white, but you do want there to be that visible splash. So let's just take a look at it now. And there you go. So you can see if you zoom in, you've got a few little white specks there. It's not that noticeable again from this angle, but if you zoom in, you should be able to see them. And it's just going to add that tiny little white speck, and that's just going to give the appearance of that splash, that impact of the droplet hitting the ground. So that should look really good. So I'm just going to make a few slight adjustments. I'm just going to increase the color of the paint, just so that where there's a puddle, it's just a little bit darker, just so that it's a little bit more obvious, a little bit more punchy than it is currently. The waves, we can't see them too well. If you zoom in, you will be able to, but just so that I can sort of see it a little bit better and you can see the effect that it's having, I'm just going to set that to -4 there. The splashes, they're fine. I should note one other final point as well. There is a downside to when we were doing the dynamic paint, setting the start frames to 30. That's really good. It saves you baking times. However, if you were to render frame 30, because you've got the splash set as it currently is, and you've got it set to screen and whatever else, if you set if you start to render the first 30 frames, you'll see that the entire road will look white. And the reason for that is that there's no texture that appears here for the splashes, so it instead tries to render a white image. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's a bug or whatever else, but the entire road will appear white. So if you render from 30 onwards, though, then it will look fine. So if you're going to render the entire animation, you just want to turn off splashes for the first 30 frames or whatever else, whatever's going on in your scene, and then turn it back on for the remaining whatever. So just a little note there, just because I know some people might run into that problem. Now I'm just going to increase this to final render, and I'll just move the camera in slightly as well if it's already on a path. Anyway, I'll just give this a final render and we'll just see how it looks now. And there we have the final render, done and dusted. That pretty much concludes the tutorial, guys. So as you can see, dynamic paint is a very, very powerful feature. I'm really, really glad that it's been added to Blender. It's got so many possibilities. If you just type in dynamic paint Blender into YouTube, you can already see some really, really cool animations that people have made. Just a few examples: you can create like a cutting steel animation somebody made, having like a laser beam cut in and engrave something into the wood. Really, really cool. You can have, as I said before, footsteps going through the snow. You can have flames, as it paints sets fire to the wall. You can have water so that when fluid effects collide with an object, it actually makes it appear wet. It's got really, really so many possibilities. It's an awesome feature. I'm hoping that this tutorial gave you sort of an introduction to dynamic paint and gave you enough confidence to go ahead, give it a try yourself. As always, I'm really interested in seeing what you guys created. So if you make something cool, or if you just want to let me know what you thought of the tutorial, go ahead, leave a comment below, and that'd be really great. Anyways, that's it from me, guys. Thanks very much for listening.